Okay, good evening and welcome everybody to yet another consultation workshop on the shaping of our electricity future. This workshop is organised primarily by Irish Rural Link as part of the EirGrid consultation process. Just that you know, EirGrid are using many of the voluntary organisations around the country, the Youth Council and others, as you will see later, in order to reach as many people as possible to ensure that you have a say and a voice in the future of our electricity. We all know that electricity and its generation will change enormously. There are targets to be met. There are major changes abroad. So we have to make sure that climate change, that the fact that jobs are kept in our country, in our environment, and in our economy. So this evening, before I introduce the panel, which I think will be an interesting and excellent panel, I just want to say that at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat facility. That facility, please use it. Put in the questions. Sometimes they get answered by the panel straight away, or they will be answered. And of course, you will have an opportunity later on to ask the questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over to James Claffey, who works with Irish Rural Link, and he has a small icebreaker to get you going, and then we'll introduce the panel.
Thanks very much, Seamus. Just give me 2 seconds here when we get technology up and working. Okay, so as Seamus said, we're just going to do a very quick icebreaker today, just to get people thinking about the topic that we're talking about. As Seamus says, we're trying to make this as interactive as we can, and we want people on the call to put their comments and questions into the chat box, and they're all going to be recorded for publication in our full report on all these consultation workshops. So for those with a smartphone, or maybe if you want to open up a new tab on your computer, we are asking people just to go to slido.com, and on slido.com then you can just insert the code 158874. And once you get there, there'll be just a very short question, I suppose, for people to fill in on Ireland should do everything possible so that by 2030 at least 70% of renewable energy comes from, or sorry, 70% of electricity comes from renewable sources like wind turbines or solar panels and other sources of energy. Would you agree with this statement, or what do you think of this statement? Strongly agree, either disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So we just might give people a minute to do that. Thanks very much, James.
Okay, to start the ball rolling, I want to introduce you to James Lynn. He's a PhD, is a research fellow at the Murray Centre for Energy, Climate, Marine, based in the Environmental Research Institute in University College Cork. James is the Irish and MRA contact point for IEA and ITSAP and the Integrated Assessment Modelling Consortium. His research interests focus on the development and application of integrated energy systems, models, and their interactions with climate, economy, society to find resilient pathways to the future of sustainable energy systems. He is an expert developer in the use of time source code, as with applications required. So James, with a great background and knowledge of the energy situation, I ask you to take the floor, and I'm sure you have some slides to put up. The floor is yours.
Okay, good evening, everybody. As Seamus said, my name is James Glynn. This evening, I'm going to just introduce things by giving a high-level perspective regarding where some of this is coming from. So why is it that we're talking about increasing renewable electricity? That's the main question that I want to address today from a high-level helicopter view. As Seamus said, I'm from the Murray Centre, which is one of the Science Foundation Ireland research centres in Ireland. We're the research centre, one of 17. We're the one that's focusing on 3 topics of energy, climate and marine. As you can see from the bottom of the title slide there, the Murray Centre is hosted in UCC, but it involves many other universities and institutions around the country. So what we do in Murray is research that addresses these 3 grand challenges that you can see on the screen. So there's the energy transition, the climate action, and blue economy are the 3 grand challenges that we're focusing on in MARI. The energy transition is to figure out how do we get to a low carbon energy future. Climate action, which includes climate reducing emissions, but also adapting to climate change. And the blue economy, which is focusing on harnessing our marine resources in as much as we can. And so these are the three areas of our focus of our research. And our goal or our mission is to do excellent research that has significant impact, both in Ireland and internationally. So we have three aspects to our impacts that we seek to achieve from our research. So we collaborate with industry, we support industry. That's one of our main impacts. We also do research that informs policy decisions nationally and internationally. And thirdly, we do research that empowers society, both nationally and internationally. So we co-develop solutions with communities and citizens around the country, including examples like in the Southwest, we're in the Dingle Peninsula project, the Imagining 2050 project, collectively co-designing the futures, the sustainable futures that citizens want in different towns and regions in the country. So starting off about the details, so the climate change is happening. So the science is very clear and is becoming clearer and clearer that climate change is happening. We're starting to see the manifestations of climate change in our everyday lives. We can see extreme weather events. That's one of the manifestations, the clearest manifestation of climate change. We're seeing that global temperatures are increasing and warming. We have sea level rise, but the extreme weather events that we see in Ireland, and particularly flooding and extreme coastal erosion, are one of the clearest manifestations of climate change that we're seeing in Ireland. So the science is also clear about where climate change is coming from and why. So I'm just going to show this chart here. We have climate change that's linked to what we're doing as humans. And now this is a representation of what's happened from a period from 1950 right up to the current date to 2015 or 2020. We can see from this that as population has risen, our population has risen, the middle pink bar there. As population has risen, this has been enabled, or population increase has been enabled by a use of fossil fuels that has delivered the comfort, the heat, the mobility, and the freedom from labor that has driven economic development. And historically, we've used fossil fuels, or fuels that are called fossil fuels, so oil, coal, and gas. And these three fossil fuels release large quantities of carbon dioxide emissions and when they're burnt, and that's contributing to climate change. There are other elements to climate change of human activity contributing, notably agriculture and industrial processes. But today we're focusing on the energy dimension of climate change. So you can see on the bottom of the chart, the green bar there, we've started to increase the amount of renewable energy generating that we're getting. So low carbon, zero carbon energies as well. But it's nowhere near as significant internationally as we have been consuming oil, coal, and gas. So our collective challenge on the planet over the next decade is to significantly reduce our fossil fuel consumption in the energy system. We need to reduce this fossil fuel consumption, and we need to increase the use of renewable energy. When you see where we've been in the past and where we need to go over the next 30 years, there's a stark change required. So we're at this very dramatic change, at this tipping point in terms of where the energy system is, where it needs to go to continue to deliver the heat and transport and electricity that we need for our energy services, but we need to significantly change the fuels that we use to generate that energy to avoid future climate change impacts. The other thing, so we said the science is clear, but it's also increasingly clear that citizens are demanding action, and most notably our young people are particularly are incorrectly putting up to the older generations and to politicians that we need to change what we're doing. We need to change how we're generating our fuels so that we have a planet that we can be proud of and that we can enjoy and that we can sustain ourselves on going into the future. So this chart shows greenhouse gas emissions historically in Ireland in blue, and the two green lines of emissions greenhouse gas emissions going forward from 2020 to 2030, and then from 2030 to 2050. And so what you can see has happened over the last number of years in Ireland. The blue line, as I said, represents historic emissions, and effectively we've seen that over time largely an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So our policy system and our policy leaders, our industry and our broader society haven't engaged well to date with climate change or reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But what we're seeing now, and that's represented by the two green lines from 2020 onwards, is that there's a very significant change in ambition. And this change in ambition is coming from the government, because this is effectively a graphical representation of what the new climate action bill and the revised climate bill, that we're looking to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by half, which is considerable, half between now and 2030, and then get rid of the other half between 2030 and 2050. So we have the science, and now we have the political leadership. The science has been there for the last 40 years, but it's only recently that it seems that the political will is emerging to tackle the severity of this challenge. So what does this mean? As I said, climate change is coming from our greenhouse gas emissions, but to look into a bit more detail, where do these greenhouse gas emissions come from? So this chart is a representation of the different things that produce greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland. You can see the role of agriculture. It's about 33% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. We have transport on the bottom right-hand corner, so fossil fuels and diesel and petrol coming from trucks and cars in the bottom right-hand corner. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have the energy requirement from our homes, and then in the top left-hand corner, the focus of our discussions today is the electricity system. So the challenge that we face and where we need to go is to effect change in reducing the emissions from each of these sectors, and we're not only talking about electricity part today, because electricity part today is only generating electricity, but we can use electricity within transport in the future, within electric vehicles, electric buses and electric trucks, to grow the electricity sector and to shrink the emissions from the transport sector. And similarly, we can use electricity to generate heat, both in our homes. So we can use heat pumps. We can also use electricity for heat in various industry sectors as well. So we have many different options about where we can generate this electricity. And when we look at Ireland, we have many opportunities and many resources, particularly our wind resource, which is the envy of Europe, the envy of many nations around the world, both onshore and offshore. So the left being onshore in the hills, and the bottom right being offshore in the oceans. We've also many other options that are newer and still in development. So we have in the top left there, we have ocean energy devices being developed down in Cove in Cork. They have prototypes being tested out in Hawaii. We have heat pumps in the bottom left-hand corner, providing extracting heat from the outdoors and pushing it inside in the house. We have solar panels on our roofs in the top right, and we have biomass for heat in our homes. We have many other options for getting around. Excuse me. We can use biofuels to power our cars and our trucks. We can generate hydrogen from renewable electricity, so create hydrogen from ocean water to store energy. And we can then transport our cars and our trucks and our vehicles with these different energy vectors. So why are we looking at renewable electricity in particular? I mentioned that both with wind energy, we have a lot of it. So in the left-hand side here, we have the onshore wind energy resource potential in Europe. And on the right-hand side, we have the offshore. So the green is where there's not a lot of wind, and the red and purple is where we have a lot of wind. And as you can see, comparable to the rest of our neighbours in Europe, Ireland has the resource potential that is, again, one of the largest in Europe. we also have a significant track record of developing wind energy in Ireland. So this graph is the final slide and the final chart I'll show. It shows over the last 15 years the share of our renewable electricity, where the renewable electricity is coming from over the period from 2005 to 2019. So in 2005, we had just over 5% of our electricity coming from renewable energy sources. But as of 2020, we've 43% of our electricity coming from renewable energy sources. This is phenomenal. One of the highest penetrations of renewable electricity in the world. We're truly world class in doing this on an isolated grid. So it's a phenomenal achievement over the last 15 years and effectively now we have this opportunity to build on this knowledge, both that EirGrid have and the developers have, to develop further this potential that we have that's untapped in our offshore wind energy resources, and it's very significant. So it's one of the key opportunities that we have. So to wrap up, the reason for developing increased renewable electricity is to develop or to tackle climate change, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and to use renewable electricity in sectors, in heating, in electricity generation, and in transport. We've very significant wind energy resource potential onshore and offshore. We're very successful at harnessing this wind energy to date. And that's effectively the message that I want to leave you with this evening. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. James Lynn. That was an excellent presentation, and I hope again there will be questions arising and in terms of, because you mentioned lots of things as to how we will generate, especially the non-renewable electricity, and of course the challenges surrounding that. I'd like to introduce you now to Michael Mahon, who joined the EirGrid group in August 2019. In his role, he's responsible for the planning and consents for grid infrastructure across the island, including public consultation processes and landowner engagement. So he's the man in that sense. He previously held the position of General Manager, ESB Smart Energy Service, 20 years experience with ESB and significant leadership in major project delivery. So Michael, if you're ready, and if your slides are ready as well, the microphone is yours.
Seamus, thank you very much for that. And thanks. It sounds like you were helping me apply for a job there with that introduction. So I think I'm just going to do a brief introduction, and actually Robbie Ahern, the head of our Future Networks team, is actually going to take you through the slides very quickly. So shaping our electricity future is a very important consultation for EirGrid, because it's going to set the plan for us between now and 2030. It's focused on the government's climate action plan target of achieving 70% renewables by 2030. And this is a very important consultation because we have different options we're proposing, and we're looking to get the feedback from these workshops, from the other workshops that we're having with the county councils, and from the various different media, other forms of engagement over the next number of months, over the next 2 months, effectively, to get some feedback and to help that, and that feedback will be central to the final option that we take forward to kind of communicate in September, and we'll plan all our projects on that basis. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Robbie, who's going to take you through the slides. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to bring you through the slides on shaping our electricity future for the next 10 or 15 minutes, and just give you an overview of it. What I'm going to do first of all is introduce you to EirGrid. What's our role in the context of the Irish electricity system and society at large. Then I'm going to talk about the role of electricity, the transformation of the electricity industry, and how that can play a role in decarbonising our economy. And then I'm going to talk about the different options that are out there and what we're looking to get feedback on as part of how our electricity grid evolves out to the end of the decade, and then look how we're looking and avenues to provide your feedback as on shaping. So first of all, who we are in EirGrid, we're an Irish-owned, government-owned company, and we operate for the benefit of the electricity user. So we're not a generator, and we have no commercial interest in where or what generators connect onto the power system. We also run the wholesale electricity market. So what that is it's a kind of the market participant to market participant, business to business, I guess, electricity market that underpins all of our electricity bills. We don't own the electricity grid, so we have no vested interest in growing an asset base. Our role is to objectively develop the electricity grid in Ireland. And look, we do that in the basis in response to government policy, or where we have to do it to make sure we have a secure, reliable power system in Ireland, and in all the different corners of Ireland. First of all, how does the grid work? Look, it is complex, it has to be said, but this slide really looks to kind of break it down into its main constituent parts. So on the left-hand side, look, that's where generators are. For the last 100 years, it's predominantly our power is predominantly coming from renewable generation, or from fossil fuel generation, so coal, oil, peat, or gas. However, over the last decade and a half in particular, we've seen the advent of renewable generation, and in particular wind, and looking forward, solar, and indeed offshore wind are likely to play an important role. That generated power is then brought up onto the electricity grid that EirGrid operates, and that's and effectively that transmits power in bulk all around Ireland. ESB networks then take that power from the electricity grid and effectively transports it out into individual homes, businesses, farms, and communities right around Ireland. And consumers then are at the end of that chain, the most important part of that chain as well, it has to be said. So consumers draw on that power and use it as I said, their homes, their businesses, their farms, whatever the case may be. And it's really important as well that that's a high quality security of supply, or quality of supply in Ireland. We would have relative to our international peers, the quality of supply in Ireland is at a very high level. And look, that's demonstrated by companies such as the semiconductor companies like Intel, say in Kildare, who are one of the reasons they choose to connect in Ireland is the high quality of supply, look, which is integral to their extremely high-end manufacturing process. Why is electricity a solution to climate change? Well, fossil fuels creates emissions. Coal, oil, peat, and gas are fossil fuels, and when you burn them, you release carbon into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, that creates climate change and that results in flooding, heating, adverse climatic conditions. But electricity generated from the renewable sources, so from the sun, which is effectively a free, clean source of power, or from wind, which is again a free, clean source of power. None of those have carbon emissions. Electricity can be generated from them. And indeed, as of last year, 43% of all our electricity consumed in Ireland came from renewable sources, which is a huge achievement relative to our to almost any part of the world, really. One of the big things that we can do by decarbonising our electricity grid is that we can also start to decarbonise other parts of our society. So if you think of your car, which is I have a diesel car myself, if you can change to an electric vehicle, which is powered and charged from an electricity grid which comes from renewable sources, obviously it's not just about decarbonising the electricity grid, but by doing that as well, you can start to decarbonise our transport emissions. Ireland's electricity grid is comprehensive. It's 6,500 kilometres across the country, represented by the red, blue and grey lines on the map there. And it transports power in bulk all around the country, out into the different towns and regions and counties right around Ireland. At the moment, about 5,000 megawatts of renewable generation is on the power system in Ireland. That gets us to about just over 40% renewables. To get to 70% renewables in the context of a growing demand, it's going to be necessary to connect upwards of 10,000 megawatts of more electricity generation. And as you can see here, this graphic represents, look, traditionally onshore wind would have been located along the west coast. It looks like solar looks like it's going to connect predominantly on the south and east coast Offshore wind is really, projects are relatively mature off the East Coast, but it has to be said that all around Ireland, onshore wind, solar and offshore wind projects are either already there or there's real concrete plans for developing those technologies. One of the challenges with it is a renewable generation is typically generated far away from the electricity is used. So in Ireland, our electricity demand is dominated by Dublin, really. It's where most of our population lives and where it's our most of our industry is as well. And indeed where we forecast that electricity usage is expected to grow most significantly. And that's really driven by large energy users, whether it's pharmaceutical plants, semiconductor plants, or data centers as well, driven by various multinational companies. To get to 70% by 2030, we're going to need to make our grid stronger and more flexible. We're going to need to increase the capacity of it so that it can flow the power that it needs to flow so that we can meet our government targets, but we can decarbonize our economy, but it's also looked that we can provide the quality of supply that consumers around Ireland rightly expect. To that end, look, we've proposed 4 different approaches by which we could develop the grid in Ireland. So where we are today at 2021 out to 2030. And really, these 4 approaches they're quite different, and they're consciously different from our perspective. We've been working on these for about 15 months, and really we wanted to put forward 4 demonstrably different approaches to spark and indeed provoke a debate around what is the right option for Ireland. We believe that the final answer is actually going to be a blend of these 4 different approaches. I'll come to them in more detail, but really what's very important is engagement with all parts and all elements of Irish society. We're very conscious that it might look like a long way away, the connection of projects in 2030 and 2030 targets. But in the context of electricity projects, 10 years, it takes a long time to develop projects and go through all the necessary steps. So it's important that we really start on that journey and start to move projects through the various stages over the coming years as quickly as possible, really. And we recognise, look, EirGrid has an important role to play here, but it is really important that we engage with stakeholders in all different parts of society to get their view on how the grid should evolve. And really, that is what shaping our electricity future is about. So talking about the first option, the generation-led approach. So if you look at the map there in the bottom right-hand corner, here we have there's a lot of quite mature, relatively mature offshore projects in development along the East Coast, going from Dundalk Bay down to North Wexford. About 4,500 megawatts. In this particular scenario, we've assumed that 4,500 megawatts of offshore wind along the East Coast effectively that power is injected directly into Dublin. Across the rest of the country, we've about 1,000 megawatts of solar and onshore wind. And the idea here is, look, if you put your generation right beside your demand, as you can imagine, look, you're going to need less connections. You have your power right exactly where you need it. In this particular scenario, important thing to note here is a number of projects we need a number of reinforcements we need to make on our existing electricity grid, over and above as well the planned projects which are at various stages of development. In this particular scenario, it's 38 projects. We've carried out a deliverability assessment. So over the next decade, we believe between around 35 and 45 projects should be deliverable over the next 10 years. And that's really about how can we continue to operate the system in a secure manner, whilst in the same time we work on it to transform it. So in this particular scenario, 38 projects, we believe that it's highly likely that we'd be able to deliver that number of projects by the end of the decade. The second approach is the developer-led approach. And this is the tried and trusted approach, really. And that's where developers decide where they want to locate, and then we build the grid out to them. So that we can flow that power from where it's generated to where it needs to be, where it's consumed by by consumers. In this particular scenario, we've about 4,000 megawatts of onshore wind, a lot of it up around the northwest area, about 2,000 megawatts of solar along the south and east coast predominantly, and about 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind off the east coast. You can see here, this reactive approach would mean where developers decide where they want to connect and we build the grid out to them, it would require 77 projects. So it's well beyond that 35 to 45 rule of thumb I mentioned there previously. We believe it wouldn't be possible to build this grid until many years after 2030. So we looked at then, okay, how could we make this scenario work? What could we do differently to make it work? So we came up with a technology-led approach. And in this particular approach, we looked at building what are called high voltage direct current cables to hoover up power in areas of the network with large amounts of renewables and then transport it in bulk to areas where the demand is highest. So for example, up in the Donegal area, we would hoover up the power in the Donegal area and then transport it in bulk down into Dublin. Looking at Mayo there, again, we'd hoover up the power in the Mayo area, transport it in bulk, perhaps via subsea cable, into Moneypoint, and then bring it into North and South Dublin via the existing 400 kV network. So, the one going from Moneypoint to Woodland and the one going from Moneypoint to Dunstown. Then we also look at incorporating smart devices to help us, I suppose, kind of manipulate how power flows on the network so that we can try and offset the need for new infrastructure. Look, this approach is complex, it's expensive. Using high voltage direct current cables in this way, look, they kind of sit on top of the grid, they're not part of the grid. But look, it is a way of bringing the number of projects from 77 down to, in this case, about 46. And that's the same generation profile as I mentioned there previously. Look, very challenging to complete in time. The fourth approach is the demand-led approach. And this is where it's kind of the opposite really of the first approach. So in the first approach, we moved a generation to where near Dublin. In this particular scenario, again, we take that developer-led approach, which was originally 77 projects. So you have about 4,000 megawatts of onshore wind, 2,000 megawatts of solar, and 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. Here we take, okay, there's a very large demand pipeline in Dublin. So we believe under some scenarios up to 27% of all our electricity could be consumed by large energy users such as data centers by 2030. We thought, okay, what would happen if some of that large pipeline, which is at the moment the developers are focused on the Dublin area, what would happen if some of that moved out into the regions where there is large amounts of renewable generation? So we moved 600 megawatts of power to a number of urban centres along the south and west coasts. So we moved 600 megawatts across Letterkenny, Sligo, Galway, Limerick, Cork and Waterford. And you can see there it had a big impact. It reduced it from about 77 projects down to 41. So that's a really positive step in the context of electricity grid deliverability. It does require, it should be noted, it does require large energy users to locate away from Dublin in different parts of the country. Then we looked at the four different approaches and compared them. We looked at them through a number of different lenses. Here you've got 6 criteria, indeed our documentation. And look, we have quite technical, detailed documentation, as well as kind of more plain English, accessible documentation. But look, we looked at it through many different angles. So this particular graphic here, blue is positive, red is negative. There's a kind of a sliding scale. If I take the first one there, about the ability to deliver the electricity grid that we need by 2030. You can see there, the generation-led scores very high, then followed by the demand-led, technology-led, and then finally the developer-led. So it was important to compare them against a number of different lenses, and really that's what we're looking for as part of this. We're looking for feedback from all different parts of society on things like this, just to make sure that we can get other people's perspective on this. It's not just about the electricity grid. We do talk as well in our Shaping Our Electricity Future documentation about changing how we run the electricity market. If you have a very different electricity grid, and if you have a very different generation portfolio, that wholesale electricity market is going to need to change. Similarly, if you have a different electricity grid and a different market and a different generation portfolio, how you operate your power system as well is also going to need to change from our National Control Centre in Dublin. Look, I'm not really going to touch too much on the market and operations side of it, but look, we have loads of information up on our website. But look, we'd have to say it is complex and it is quite niche. But look, we'd absolutely welcome any feedback, and indeed, I'm happy to take any questions people would have on that. We're very keen to hear the views of all stakeholders. So obviously, we are working with Irish Rural Link for workshops and communities right around Ireland. We're also working with the Chambers Ireland, and we're having with the different chambers of commerce in different parts of the country. Last week, we had a really good workshop at the Youth Council of Ireland. And that built on 8 kind of pre-workshops they would have had with the different kind of I suppose groups that feed into the National Youth Council of Ireland. There was about 60 people on the call, and look, it was great to get that young voice, that kind of I think our current and also our future leaders of Irish society. We had an industry forum there last week. We're going to have a civic society forum as well to go out and talk to different voices in Irish society. And over the next number of weeks as well, we're going to have what's called a deliberative assembly. So it's kind of modelled on the citizens' assembly that's run by the government. Look, in the northeast area, we had the Kildare Mead grade upgrade, which was just announced there a number of weeks ago. The East Mead North Dublin project, the North-South interconnector project, an interconnector between outside Dublin, outside Belfast, large energy users as well. Certainly in the northeast region, there's real interest from large energy users, whether it's pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, or data centers as well. There's a big pipeline there as well, and also offshore wind, as I mentioned, after particularly off that Dundalk Bay down to North Dublin. And look, we're keen to get people's views, and we really want to hear people's views as we set off on this journey out to 2030. We have a number of different avenues, so we're very happy to take it via our consultation, via email. Look, everyone on the call here tonight is tech savvy, but look, we're conscious that not everyone is, and it's important to provide a voice and an opportunity for all different parts of our society to provide input. So to that end, look, we're very happy to take submissions by post as well. Our consultation, it opened on the 8th of March. It's open until the 14th of June. And look at where it's long. It's a long period because, look, we're conscious this is complex. We want to get out there, talk to people, brief them on it to help make sure that we can make this consultation as fruitful as possible. And we're also conscious as well, look, there's a global pandemic and it is difficult to do things like this. So look, there's a number of different avenues there. And look, we are very keen to get people's feedback on shaping our electricity future. Thanks very much, James. Seamus.
Thanks very much, Robbie and Michael. That was really a really interesting and excellent presentation, and certainly some interesting points raised. So we'll come back to that. I notice that you are putting some questions in. Please keep that going. An odd question gets answered along the way as well. So I hope that continues. And I think it's important to say that you are in many cases leaders in your own community. So I hope you will make this workshop known to people. We did, in fact, consult in terms of advertising a wide group, including the radio stations, organizations, PPN networks, public representatives, IFA, on a whole range of organizations. So we continue to reach out to them. The next subject I think will be very interesting as well. And I can say this as by way of introduction in terms of Irish Rural Link. I remember when Irish Rural Link had started and I attended many regional meetings as a member, there was a great cry for creating community activity, no matter what that activity was. And rural Ireland has a great tradition of doing the community stuff, the water schemes, the various programs that cooperatives, etc., that rural Ireland have managed to build, mainly with the aim of keeping people in the rural community. And I think that's really the goal from Irish Rural Link's perspective. And that's why we sat through many a meeting where industries couldn't be lured into areas because the electricity simply wasn't up to scratch. That's a few years ago now, I can tell you. But still, the whole idea is, can we get communities involved in the generation? So this is why I'm going to introduce to you a very interesting person, Bill Kelly. Bill is regional community manager of Community Power. They focus on the training and education of community groups in the preparation and presentation of their energy generation projects in the RESS auction framework. Building on our success in RES, he says, we provide comprehensive community-focused turnkey engagement covering things such as the policy framework, the rationales underpinning community projects, community models and legal entities, site location, grid planning, financial and funding, bid preparation and contracts preparation, as well as project management and build out. And I think this will be a very interesting talk and then. So Bill Kelly, the microphone, the screen and everything else is yours. Off you go.
Thank you, Seamus. And good evening, everybody. I just get my screen up here.
That's good.
Can we all see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. I'll drive straight ahead. So thank you, Seamus, and everybody. Everybody else, Community Power, our agenda is what is Community Power? Who are we? We'll also talk about the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, Renewable Energy Communities, and the future as we see it unfolding. Community Power, we are essentially a community of communities in the energy generation, energy advocacy, and energy supply sectors, promoting and protecting the interests of the community energy generation sector. For 100% community-owned projects, primarily wind and solar, and a little bit of hydro, with anaerobic digestion and biogas in planning. We're available at communitypower.ie. We operate in 3 sectors. Firstly, numerous energy generation projects, primarily wind and solar. These take the form of limited companies, CLGs, co-ops, and PLCs. And these entities are selling their power into the national grid. The second sector, we have one energy resale company, and that sells power from the national grid to homes, farms, and businesses across the country, everywhere from Cork to Donegal and Dublin to Galway. One representative organisation, it's a not-for-profit, promoting the interests of the 100% community-owned generators and promoting their interests to the public, the government, the Department of Climate and Communications, SEAI, the regulator, EirGrid, ESB Networks, SEMO, and the EU. And it's very important to say that our voice has to be heard in Brussels as well. Our primary projects include Temple Community Wind Farm, operational since 2012, joined by Claremorris Community Solar Farm in Mayo. It was successful in the first RES auction last year, and also joined by Galway Community Renewables in Tuam, or just outside Tuam, again successful in the RES auction last year. Community Renewable Energy Supply, trading as Community Power, and that's the resale company, and the nationwide not-for-profit, representing the promoting and representing the interests of the generators. So briefly on Temple Derry, community development initiative. It's where the community power model was conceived and developed. And that model is well established now since 2012. Temple Derry comprises 2.3 megawatt turbines, 4.6 megs in total. That's the equivalent of powering over 3,000 average Irish homes. And interestingly, it grosses 1.1 million per annum for the parish of Temple Derry. It has never gone below that in its 8.5, 9 years of operation. It has often gone above it. And we are very strongly of the view that every parish in Ireland should have something similar, be it wind or solar or a combination of both. And by parish there, we don't just mean rural, although it's primarily rural. It can be on the edge of towns and cities as well. Looking briefly at Claremorris, the community power model started to gain traction here in Claremorris. It's a collaboration between the Claremorris community and Mayo County Council, a 5 megawatt solar farm. It's a repurposed former municipal landfill site, and we're also reintroducing native flora and fauna there as well. From conception in 2019 to construction in Q4 21, it's a three-year project. COVID may push this to Q1 2022. And here we have Mayo County Council congratulating the Claremorris community on their success in the RES auction. And then Galway Community Renewables, again, the community power model gaining more traction with the Tuam Barnadare community, a 5 megawatt solar facility. Again, 3 years from conception to build out. COVID may push it back slightly. And here we have the chairman of the group talking to the local stakeholders over Zoom and showing them the site map for the solar farm. We sell electricity nationwide. We offer fair, transparent pricing, 1 month rolling contracts, so people can leave in the domestic market, so people can leave whenever they wish without any exit fees. Annual contracts do apply on the commercial and industrial sites. The money you spend with us stays in Ireland to help communities to develop their own energy generation projects. We would say to people, be the change you want to see, support the local circular economy. And finally, on this item, we're available online at communitypower.switch, but we would say to people, we also protect the floor price for the generators when their RES contract expires in 15 to 20 years' time. You don't want to be a price taker, you want to be a price shaper effectively. So who are we in community power? Who are the people and where are we? Personnel and locations. So our NENA office, John Fogarty, a lot of people will know John from his advocacy for the last number of years. John is our MD and Noel Carey is our finance director. Myself, Greg and Sarah then operate on the ground. Both John and Noel are founding members of Templederry Community Farm and also of Community Power. Since RES 1 in 2020, we were joined by the Claremorris community. We have an office there, and JP Prendergast, whom some of you may know, is one of the main players in Claremorris, but there are 6 or 7 individuals driving that project. And we would hope as more projects come through RES, we'll have an office here in Limerick and further south, and of course, cross into Dublin as well. So going on to talk about the RES Renewable Electricity Scheme. It's a state initiative to incentivize the production of renewable electricity. It is auction-based. In other words, sealed bids are invited from qualified generators or potential generators, community generators in our case, for the production of specific quantities of electricity for a specific period of time, usually 15 years, at a set price. It was introduced in 2020 and expects to run for 4 to 5 years in its current format. There are 2 sections in the annual auction. The community section is the one we're interested in. It is the smaller of the 2 sections. So the community pot itself, the maximum project size for a community pot is 5 megawatts, and the minimum size is half a meg. To put that in perspective, the average Irish home consumes 4.2 megawatts per annum. So essentially you're producing in an hour what a home will consume in a year. So the projects now have to be 100% community owned. We are lobbying the whole time to increase the size of the community pot from the 1% to increase it upwards. And we would also like to think that in time, communities will become sufficiently large and sufficiently skilled to be able to compete in the larger pot. This particular slide here, it gives an indication of the department's thinking. When they were framing the policy for RES, they came down and visited us in Templederry, and they satisfied themselves that the Templederry model stands up. Now, they're not saying that every community generation project has to be identical to Templederry. They're saying it is a model that can be adapted by communities if they so wish. What the department are keen to see is, as they say here in their slide, a flourishing community across the country, or community of communities of generators. And of course, we've already started that process now, joined by Claremorris and also by Galway. So to start on that road, what does a community need to do? So the first item is identify a plot of land in your parish. For a solar farm, 5 megawatt solar farm, 20 acres would usually be sufficient, somewhat less for a wind farm. Apply for a grid connection assessment. This will cost €2,000 plus VAT, and it's payable to ESB networks. This essentially assesses the land for grid connection. You are, in layman's terms or layperson's terms, you're doing three things. You're getting in a queue, you're getting a price for the full connection, and you're getting a timeline. And of course, to do this, you need written approval from the landowner to have the land assessed if the community doesn't actually own the land. You're also well advised to have a lease option in place with the landowner as well. Once you receive the grid offer from networks, you're now in the queue with your grid cost and your timeline. And if your grid cost is reasonable, you can then proceed to apply for planning permission and to enter the auction. So to enter the auction, you need your grid offer, your planning permission, your lease, your land lease in place, your community cooperative constitution in place, and verified financials. You prepare and submit your bid. Assuming your bid is successful in the auction, or that it's accepted, you can proceed to contracts and construction. And crucially here, community power is available to help any and all communities with any and all of these steps. But the big takeaway from this slide is you must get in the queue. And remember, you can be in that queue for a year or more, but the game doesn't start really, or the dance doesn't start until you get to the queue, you know. Some ideas on financials. Now we're looking at just a very brief helicopter view here for a solar farm, and taking the expenditure box first on the left-hand side. The key figure here is the first one highlighted in yellow at the top, your grid assessment application. Once you get that figure from ESB networks, once you're in the queue, you can then populate all the other headings, and you can find out very quickly what it will cost you to put your solar farm on the map, so to speak. On the other box then, on the income side, the key determinant here is the bid price that you put into the auction. And judging on last year's figures, in the last year's auction, I've done some rough figures here, and you can see that giving a gross revenue of under $750,000 per annum, and that sort of looking at that sort of gross revenue versus gross income, this type of project would make very good financial sense. Some ideas on shares and funding. Assuming you have a build-out cost of, let's say, 3.7 million. Here is one example of how you could address that. And we're using this now for our Limerick project, which is going into Res 2 later on this year. So issuing for a PLC, community-owned PLC, we issue A and B type shares, and just running down through the A share first in the blue box. The A share conveys an ownership right, ownerships, and it has a voting right. One per person, they're not transferable, a price of €1,000. Now we can make that lower if we wish. It will pay a dividend, and that's the board will determine that in any given year. It does not pay a coupon, and it's targeted at the local audience. Flipping over then to the B type share, it doesn't convey ownership, it doesn't have a voting right, but there are multiple shares available per person. The price, again, you can fix that 500 or 1,000, depending, whatever the community decide. It doesn't pay a dividend, but it does pay a fixed coupon, fixed return for a fixed number of years. And that is targeted at locals and non-locals. That's really your funding mechanism in the PLC model. And you can see there, if you issue 3,500 B shares and 300 A shares, you can very easily address your funding requirement. For rural environments, if you don't have the population numbers, you can always to use this model as it is currently shown here. You can always avail of the Community Power Green Bond, and it's available for financially sound 100% community-owned projects. Looking at timelines in RES, here are 4 projects here, Templederry pre-RES, and you can see the yellow portion there in the bottom half of the screen. It shows you how long from conception to construction. So Templederry took a long time, but it was before RES and all the RES supports. Claremorris and Tuam, the next 2 years turnaround. Now, as I say, COVID may shove that out a little bit. Our RES 2 projects, we're hoping we will have the Limerick one turned around within 12 months. That's from conception to construction, assuming we're successful in the RES auction later on this year. And that is everything now from getting into the queue and getting our grid offer, which we have, and getting ready for planning. Now, they may not all be that quick, but it can be done that quickly. That's the important point. Renewable energy communities. This is the generic name for the community-owned company that will place the bid in the RES auction. It must comply with all the rules as laid down by the department to enter the auction. And the questions you should be asking yourself is, how will your REC be structured? Who owns what, and how will it be run? Will it have open, voluntary, and inclusive membership, be transparent in operation, 1 member, 1 vote, meet all the RES requirements and more, have a constitution that protects against mission drift, and also have appropriate asset locks to protect the community's assets. In terms of the RES and your REC and how they might interact, here are the basic steps on the left-hand side for RES. And when you align those with your renewable energy community, in terms of timelines, it's important to keep in mind that you don't have to have your legal entity set up to apply for your grid assessment. Now, if you have, well and good, but if you don't, it doesn't become a stumbling block. After you get your grid assessment, then you have to put your legal entity in place, because there's no point going for planning, etc., without that in place. The future, as we see it unfolding, in 2012, Templederry on its own. In 2020, joined by Claremorris and Galway in RES 1. In RES 2, we have just over 30 communities preparing for RES 2. Not all of them will make RES 2 because some planning permissions may not be ready in time, but the spillover will go into RES 3 the following year. We would say to people and communities, be part of the movement. It's an alternative economic development model whereby you can enrich your communities economically, socially, culturally, while saving the planet. And to look at that graphically, in 2020, there are 3 of us. 2021, with RES 2, we expect that to go over 10. And in 2023, we expect it to double again, at least, and to grow on from there with RES 4, 5, etc. It's important to keep in mind that access to the representative organization and the energy resale company is optional for each local generator. Next steps, get into the queue, submit your grid connection assessment application. We can do that for you and with you. At 2,500, it's the best feasibility study you'll ever commission. And remember, the ESB networks will hold it open for you for 2 years after they give it to you to allow you to go for planning permission, etc. We would say to people, be the change you want to see. Sign up with Community Power for your home and business electricity. Finally, I would say to you, the Ardnacrusha scheme in the 1920s, it was transformative for the young state. The RES community pot in the 2020s, with 3 of us starting out, it has the potential to be transformative for communities in the 2020s. We are currently at 17% of Ardnacrusha after our first year. It is a most wonderful opportunity for communities to generate income for themselves on a very sound commercial footing. I would leave it open for questions there. Seamus, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was, again, extremely interesting. And again, I think your last slide, when you talked about Ardnacrusha and the potential, that it brought at the young state's time, and now the potential Community Power has to encourage communities to get involved. I think that's really, really fantastic. Just some brief questions before we go into the break. session. And I see Kevin Kinsella, you're asking, can James give guidance on the relative costs of various energy generation methods? James, do you want to take that question quickly? We can tease out these questions in the break workshops in a moment, but just to take that one, James, if you can.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So to group things, I suppose, in different types of technologies, we have our, I'm going to presume we're looking at the differences between fossil fuels, so generating from coal, generating from gas, generating from onshore wind, offshore wind, and generating from solar, let's say. There's other more exotic technologies that we'll probably need to look at beyond 2030, the likes of capturing carbon dioxide, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and maybe hydrogen power generation. But if we just look at what's currently being used, to build a wind turbine is roughly 1.3 million euro per megawatt. An open cycle gas powered turbine might be about 700,000 euro per megawatt. A combined cycle might be just over 1 million per megawatt. Coal would be about, again, depending on the efficiency, in and around slightly more than €1 million per megawatt. The difference is that while to build a wind farm might be slightly more expensive per megawatt than gas or coal, there is no fuel cost, whereas of course we spend 6.5 billion euros per year importing oil, coal and gas into the country, and each ton of carbon dioxide that we emit in our power system is currently costing us about €45 per ton, which again also adds up and it is going to get more and more expensive. So that's the general figures. If somebody needs clarification on that, I can add a little more detail or summarize that.
In the workshops, indeed. Thanks for that. Eamon Donlan, just is there enough private sector investment interest to further develop the wind sector, and more investors, or are there more investors needed to ramp up? I don't know who could take that question, but I'll just throw it out to the panel.
Maybe myself or Robbie could take it.
Yeah.
Okay. I think in general there's a lot of projects being planned. There's a lot of people looking to develop new projects. I think the challenge is making sure that there's a viable business case there. So that's what we're very keen to support in terms of making sure that we're driving down the price of electricity through the market, but also making sure that the projects are investable for the investors. And part of the challenge with that is that the one element is connecting the project to the grid. And the second element is actually for us to fully take all of the power from that project at a particular point in time. And sometimes that leads to reinforcement projects where we need to improve the extent of the grid at that point to allow us to transport the power. So it's kind of related to some of these projects. We can connect like thousands of gigawatts to the system, but it's useless unless we're upgrading the transmission infrastructure. And that's why that's an essential part of this consultation. There's different ways to improve that infrastructure, and which is the best way. But ultimately, the idea is by committing to these projects, by getting them built, it makes the case more investable for the developer.
Thanks, Michael. Sarah Riley, thank you for that question. James answered it. Of course, presentations will be available on our website, irishorelink.ie, and of course the webinar will be available in the coming days. And Yvonne English is making an observation, which I'm sure will be teased out in the workshops. Some people along the North Interconnector are very upset as we're discriminated against. All other recent projects of EirGrid are being undergrounded, and we have to put up with pylons near the houses. So that's, I know, a contentious issue and something that needs to be dealt with as well. What plans, says Kevin Trainer, are there to connect to the European electricity grid for when wind does not blow? Maybe we're placing our eggs in one basket for future development of renewable energy. Don't know, Kevin, but does anyone want to take that one?
So I think we'll touch on the north-south maybe in the breakout rooms. In terms of what connect to Europe, well, we have the Celtic Interconnector project that's looking to connect a 700 megawatt connection from Cork to Brittany in France. Target energization date for that project is 2026. So that's a project that we're jointly developing with RTE, our equivalent in France. And that's a vital infrastructure project. It's vital to support the 2030 targets to allow us, as Kevin has suggested, to us to import electricity when the wind isn't blowing. But when we have plenty of wind, it gives us the opportunity to export that wind and sell it actually in the European continent as well. So the exciting thing about that is, as well as importing, the opportunity to export and actually potentially be a net exporter of electricity is a great opportunity for Ireland.
Okay. Yeah, Robbie, come on.
Yeah, I'm just going to expand on what Michael has said then. Absolutely interconnection. We also, like when we, by 2030, it's 70% from renewable sources, but 30% from conventional sources, so driven by fossil fuels. And we believe by 2030, predominantly gas. And look, we're aware, and it's a really good question, there are going to be points in time when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And so it's important to have what's called conventional generation there to make sure that we can supply power at all times of the year. So it's something that we're keeping a very close eye on.
Okay, well, look, you get a lot more chance, everybody, to talk in the chat rooms that James is going to organize. So James, will you come back in and tell us what's next? Have we lost James?
Apologies, Sam, is on mute and talking to myself as usual. So thanks very much to the presenters, and I think we're a little bit more on time tonight than we have been for previous ones. So as Seamus says, we're just going to break out into two breakout sessions now for some discussion on these questions. So in your opinion, where should new renewable energy generation be located? And question two, what do you believe should determine where renewable electricity is located? So there are the two questions that we're going to break out into. So if everyone could just accept their invite into the different groups, that would be great. And I'm going to do that now and should take a second. And we'll come back in about half an hour then for the plenary session, and we'll finish off with a couple of closing remarks and questions.
I think we're all back into the main room after the chats. I was at Group 1, very interesting dialogue. Thank you very much, Kate, for that. So maybe I'll start with you, Kate, in terms of feedback, because it was a most interesting conversation.
Yeah, so I suppose that we discussed, the effect of the pylons on communities and people's concerns around their health and the value of property, and questions around why the North-South interconnector particularly couldn't go underground. And we had Michael Mahon from EirGrid explaining the reasons behind that. The other, I suppose, issue that came up was about landowners generally and farmers being, it's so important that they're front and center in these processes of consultation. And one possible solution, I think, that is being looked at as well, is to develop an agreed code of practice around these things, because sometimes the CPOs, the compulsory purchase orders, can be, a difficult way to go and difficult for people to deal with. There was also, I suppose, discussion about, just the processes of consultation and how important, this openness and, building trust with communities is. And, I think events like this are hopefully contributing to that. Then we had members from NEP, the Pylon group, and they are hopefully going to meet shortly with EirGrid in Cavan and Monaghan County Councils to talk about their concerns. And there was a comment also made about, data centres and the, I suppose that they're very power hungry, and that, the idea of investing money into communities rather than these sort of multinational data centres that maybe don't provide long-term employment. So I think that was just a summary of what we discussed, and I think if there's any other questions or if anybody else wants to bring up anything else, you can pop it in the chat.
Thanks very much, Kate. And as I said, yeah, please do keep the chat button going, because all these things are useful in terms of feedback. And as I said, interesting workshop. Brendan, I think you were in the other workshop. I hope it was good as well. You're on mute at the moment, so we don't know.
Forgive me. Hi, I was just saying the voice of East Coast farmers came out loud and clear in the group. And what came out of that was that farmers have a very clear role to play in micro generation of electricity, and that they need to be sort of fully respected in this process. And that there's scope to expand their role in the coming years. One concern was that it would need to be equitably distributed across the country. That if farmers were to be, benefiting from this, it wouldn't work if it was in just one part of the country. That it would need to be sort of fairly and transparently managed. Another point was made that it's very important that this transparent communication process continues, in the coming years, beyond this process. And also it was clear that it seems to be leaning towards generator-led in terms of, that seems to be the most practical message that we're getting from today, and that there was kind of agreement in that. There was a strong enough concern that while we might hit our targets by 2030, if the price of that is very rigid kind of privatization at the neglect of communities, then that mightn't be a price that should be immediately paid, and that needs to be looked into in more depth. And the point was made, just as we finished up there, that possibly the questions are too simplistic, that they're not as simple as, the two questions that we were offered. So I think we all kind of understood that it's more complicated than that, but there'd be concerns that things will get lost in trying to just simplify things too much. So I think that was it. And again, if I missed anything, please stick it in the chat there.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for that. I see Eva Farrell is just reminding you where you can go to the public consultation. The deadline is the 12 noon on the 14th of June. Now, before I take a last word from the three panelists, you can be preparing that last word. Anyone feel there's anything they didn't get a chance to say or want to say in terms of this consultation workshop? It's getting late, and I know you've all have probably had a long day, but still, if anybody feels there's something they didn't get around to saying, please do so now. Don't see anybody rushing, or is there? No? Okay, just going around the screen. Okay, shout if I didn't hear you or see you. Okay, for a last word, I'll start with you, James, Dr. James Lynn. You started the ball rolling. In terms of some of the feedback you would have heard, there is a lot of concern about delivering this whole process. And I suppose there is also the pressure on delivering it at all, because that's another thing. What's your last words on this?
I suppose to reiterate what my closing remarks around the presentation was that the climate science is real, that we know that the impacts are coming, and so that there isn't so much the need for growth for renewables is strong, and it's plain to see the growth for renewables is needed in electricity because it's the easiest option, and then after 2030 there's more difficult options that are needed to get us back on track to stabilize the climate. So from our modeling and our systems analysis, this is the first step, and it's a key step for a safe and stabilized climate.
And if I may go to Bill. Bill, again, Bill Kelly, you, as you said, gave a very impressive presentation in terms of the community. How do we get more of the community involved in the generation of electricity? I know you're working really hard, but what's your want from policymakers, etc.?
Well, I'd say two things. The department at a get-together 10 days ago, the department said they are adamant they want at least 100 community generators. They're not going to stop until they get at least that. Now, I'm not, and when you consider that the department are going to fund a community to get as far as the auction, and then once they're successful in the auction, they're going to give them a government contract to build their generator, and they're going to pay the community for the power that generator produces. In other words, it's win-win-win. I cannot think of a more inclusive and positive package from the government for communities. And I say it here in this forum, it is more beneficial for rural, it's more applicable for rural communities. I mean, it's never going to get any better than it is right now. And could you imagine the transformative effect of 100 communities around the country with their own generators? And that the clout that will give communities then when they're trying to shape the future, the green future. So I would say the communities, it's never been as easy. Get involved, get your hands dirty. Okay.
Thanks, Bill. I think it's a powerful statement. To either Robbie and of course Michael might finish off. Robbie, do you want to add anything to the discussion, and then I'll finish off with Michael.
No, look, I'd like to thanks for everyone for taking the time out of their evening to talk to us. I found it really obviously the breakout session I was on. We spoke a lot about microgeneration and I suppose the appetite of kind of the wider community to play their role in meeting renewable targets. And look, it is a message we've been hearing. And look, it's definitely landed with us. So look, again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of their calendars and to meet us tonight.
Thank you, Michael.
Seamus, thank you. I suppose the first thing I just want to say is Bill has completely sold me in terms of community power. I was generally an advocate of it before, but I'm going to look at it hard myself, my own kind of background. Absolutely, he sold that to me completely. I think the big message for me is the importance of engagement. I'm really happy to have this opportunity tonight, recognize the impact that projects like the ones we're talking about has on communities, and want to work with communities to find solutions. Sometimes we have easier solutions than others, and we're up for engaging with communities, with the relevant groups who are concerned, like NEPP, in terms of our projects, and serious about having meaningful engagements, and really look forward to working with people and hopefully getting some good submissions into the consultation, and as part of this, that we can help to kind of harness and kind of come up with our kind of final output in September of this year. And just to thank everyone for their time again.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. And I'd like to thank everybody who came here tonight, who took those couple of hours, despite having to get kids to bed and all sorts of stuff. Unusual settings we live in, unusual times, but really I appreciate that. Thanks to the facilitators, to the IRL staff, to James, of course, and Maria, who managed to put all this together. Look, keep talking is the message. Engage with EirGrid, and they really do want to hear and try and come up with solutions. I hope we do, and I hope you do. So have a good evening. Thank you, and make sure you get your submissions in before June 14. Thank you very much. Good night.